So you mentioned warranties, and that kind of made me think of, but I just saw a billboard. I can't remember the company offhand, but it had a big thing advertising a 20-year warranty on a furnace.
Yeah,
Tell me about that.
yeah, for sure. So, recently, like I think one thing that companies are using as like a sales technique is these longer and longer warranty periods. Now, of course, a warranty has value, right? It means that hopefully, unless you gotta be careful to fine print of the warranty, but it means you're not going to have to worry about extra expenses through the term of that warranty, right? We're all familiar with like extended warranties, similar kind of idea. But what we're seeing recently is these warranty periods are getting longer and longer. And as you said, like these 20-year warranties, that becomes like an obvious sales technique because the life expectancy of a furnace nowadays is typically 15 to 20 years. So we know that within that 20-year, regardless of what equipment you're putting in, it's going to fail within that period of time. So ultimately, what this boils down to is these companies are just using that as like a sales tool to charge a lot more for that equipment up front. And they know that they're going to have to potentially honor that warranty at some period of time, but they're kind of baking that in up front. And for the customer, again, pros and cons. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but ultimately you're sort of paying for that replacement with the initial cost. Also have to be aware of like sometimes there's some fine print, like you might have to pay them for an annual service on the equipment. So they're coming out every year and it's a couple hundred, two, three, 400, whatever they want to charge every year. So if you add up the total cost of this, you may be paid for that furnace twice anyways. So, in 15 years, yeah, maybe they're giving you a new furnace, but you've effectively paid for that already anyways.
Yeah, that makes sense. On the topic of cost of furnaces,
Yeah.
so obviously, especially in Ontario, rebates are a big thing. You see it really kind of pushed by a lot of companies. There's a lot of, I would say, variance in how companies choose to market the availability of rebates.
Sure.
But it's obviously a way to bring costs down for furnace. So very appealing as a homeowner. But tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So rebates typically, you said, like different jurisdictions have different programs. There's federal and provincial rebates that are usually available to kind of convolute things. Sometimes manufacturers have rebates too, but that's really just like a discount. Yeah. So typically these programs that we're talking about though are government-based programs. The programs themselves are usually great. Like they're going to give you some money back for upgrading your equipment. The problem that we see is that companies, especially the less ethical ones, will leverage the fact that these rebates are a little bit complicated sometimes. So for the average homeowner, it's sometimes a little bit overwhelming to try to understand the program. So it's quite often not as simple as there's a $5,000 rebate available for your furnace. There's more steps involved, etc. And so what we find not uncommonly is that companies will sometimes outright lie about what their requirements are, and they'll use that as an upsell. So they'll try to sell you additional equipment and tell you, oh, you need to install this in order to qualify for the rebate, things like that. Or sometimes they'll use that as a mechanism to just increase the price, right? Because they know you're going to get a couple $1,000 rebate. Maybe that price point is a couple thousand or $1,500 more than it would otherwise cost. So really something that, again, I guess it comes, unfortunately, is on the homeowner to kind of understand how the programs actually work, to be able to navigate whether they're being taken advantage of a little bit there.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you were talking earlier the story of a specific when you were doing audits for these kind of rebates
Yeah.
that you saw. Can you share a little bit more about that specific case? We don't need to name the company necessarily, but
Yeah.
what did you see there?
Yeah, so and we can kind of get into this a little bit separately, but it's not an uncommon thing where we have what I would call like ghost HVAC companies. And what they really are is these sales organizations that probably don't even employ HVAC technicians. They basically just contract all that out. Typically, what they do is very unethical sales techniques and tactics. They're kind of the high pressure sales people, and they pay these people enormous commissions to sell them. And then they just sort of, you get a white van contractor that shows up to actually install it. So typically, terrible service after the fact, you've paid way too much for it, etc. The one particular incident that we were chatting about, so again, unfortunately, a lot of the times it's elderly homeowners who are, by themselves that tend to get taken advantage of. That particular situation, the woman had, and I had a number of cases that were similar to this. She had been sold an HVAC system on a rental agreement, and it was a furnace and AC for sure. I can't remember if there was anything else involved. Oh, water heater as well. A furnace, AC, and a water heater, tankless water heater. Long story short, the equipment was really overkill. She had a very small house. She didn't need all of those. And they had told her that she needed to get all of this equipment in order to qualify for the rebates, which was not the case. They were isolated rebates. There was rebates available for all of them, but they sort of told her, oh, you have to upgrade the tankless water heater in order to get the furnace rebates. They just sort of blurred the lines when in fact those are separate rebates. She could have gotten them separately. And then, while I was there, she actually told me that they had called her after and tried to sell her, I think it was it was an air filtration system that was quite expensive. That would couple with your furnace, and it was UV light filter, and it was several $1,000s. And they told her that she needed to install that in order to qualify for the rebates. And clearly, it's just straight up unethical salespeople in that case. And we would see that to lesser degrees in a lot of situations, right? That one was a particularly egregious example of someone just being taken advantage of. But we'd see small instances of that here and there as well, where they'd kind of tied the sale to sell them more than what they actually needed. Again, leveraging the rebates and trying to lead them to believe that they needed to do more in order to qualify for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to come back to the ghost companies after, but I want to ask you just a little bit more on the rebate side.
Yeah.
As a homeowner, obviously, so you mentioned a little bit of it, the onus is on the homeowner to investigate what do I actually have to do to qualify.
For sure.
But where would you recommend a homeowner start, if they've gotten a quote and a rebate is part of that quote?
Yep.
What would you recommend a homeowner do to kind of educate themselves? Where should they start?
Yeah, so typically, probably the most reliable source would be the government of Canada. Actually has a database of that. So if you put it on Google and you say furnace rebates or energy efficiency rebates in Canada, and just make sure that what you're picking is a Canada.ca results. The federal government has kind of a database. So it's the government of Canada's website initially, and they actually have links to the provincial level programs as well, and even municipal programs if they're available. So they're pretty good at keeping up to date on that. And you can link through. That said, the programs are sometimes a little bit complicated. Like I said, especially if there's a few programs, etc. There you can talk to an independent energy advisor. Again, be careful of that. You can get a list of that through the Government of Canada's website. They're called EnerGuide Energy Advisors. That's what I used to do. But they're independent energy auditors who are experts in the program. So typically you can reach out to one of those. They may try to book you an energy appointment that you don't necessarily need right away, but usually they're very well informed on the programs and might be able to help you navigate that a little better.
Yeah, perfect. So let's get into this ghost companies thing. You mentioned what these ghost companies sort of are.
Yep.
Which are sales organizations,
For sure.
disguised as a furnace air conditioning company.
Yep.
But what would you say are the signs to look for, or how can a homeowner identify if they've sort of engaged with a company like this?
Yeah, so it's not sort of a perfect science. These companies are historically hard to nail down because they'll change names all the time, right? So they might change names every 6 months, a year, or whatever. As soon as that kind of reputation catches up to them, they just change names. They tend to use names that, I'm going to make up a couple here, but they tend to incorporate things that sound governmenty. So Ontario Savings or Ontario Heating Savings Program, that kind of thing. So they sort of give you the impression that they're associated with the government. These companies, they used to do door-to-door sales. So typical thing was they would come and they would have a vest on, they would come to your door and they'd say, oh, we're in your area, we're doing inspections to make sure that you have the latest equipment. Of course, they get in the door and then they're just going to sales pitch you on a new HVAC system. Thankfully, the Ontario government has made that illegal. They can no longer do door-to-door sales, so make sure you report that if you see it. But back to your question, I think a couple of things you want to look out for. One, you want to look for like a company with a name that you recognize locally. So if you've seen branded trucks in your local area, obviously that's a really good sign that it's a local company, maybe nationally owned or that sort of thing, but they're at least a reputable company. These other companies, you very rarely would actually see them. And then again, you want to look at Better Business Bureau, online reviews, because even some of the, local or locally recognizable companies do engage in some of those unethical practices to varying degrees, right? So those ghost companies are definitely the worst, but then you get even some local companies, unfortunately, that, engage in some of those tactics.
Yeah, good to know. Let's talk about that specific, like some of these unethical tactics. You've talked on it a little bit, but this idea of like unnecessary upsells, right?
Yep.
Typically, it's going to be like because you've had a furnace fail or some other big problem,
Right.
and while the technician is there, they start telling you need X, Y, Z. What have you seen is really common in terms of like these? Like, what are the common upsells that these places try and make? And then how do you detect it?
Yeah. So again, like when you're in that situation, your furnace is broken down, you're kind of in a vulnerable spot, right? You just want to get your furnace fixed. And maybe you sort of don't have your wits about you, I guess, because you're a little bit stressed about that situation. So that's something to keep in mind when you're navigating this is, don't rush the process. Obviously, you might need to take care of the heating situation quickly, but, typically those other things that they're going to try to sell are not things that you need to, commit to right away. Again, I would say some of the things that are big red flag, which again is common with these like ghost companies, are smart home services. Could be like a smart thermostat, which realistically is inexpensive, but they charge, quite a bit for it. It could be home monitoring, water purifiers are a common one, water heaters. So yeah, like virtually any product that company sells, again, depending on, the company and how much they engage in that. Again, another common thing, and unfortunately with some of the really large companies, the national companies, the technicians have sales quotas. So the technician that's there to install your furnace may have a sales quota. So they've already sold the furnace. He's looking for something else that he can sell you, right? So he's looking at your water heater, your water purifier if you have one. So those are common things. And I think the biggest thing to keep in mind there is you don't have to deal with that now, right? They're not tied together. Your water heater has nothing to do with your furnace. Your water purifier, same thing. They're isolated systems, and you can take your time to do your research. I'm not saying, maybe they're saying, hey, you need to upgrade your water heater, and that might be legitimate advice, but definitely take the time to get a second opinion or third opinion on that because they may just be trying to sell you a system.
Yeah, that makes sense. On the note of emergency situations, right? Furnace fails. I've seen a few companies that advertise next day installation.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about that. Is that a good idea? What do I need to be cautious of?
Yeah, again, it's kind of interesting that they offer that as, or they'll advertise it as, a pitch, right? Like a value that they offer. Unfortunately, I think a big part of the intent there is to install the system so quickly that you don't have time to rethink, like to shop around. If they're installing the next day, and I know that there are some companies that it is very intentional, that they're again typically these companies that use some of these high pressure sales tactics, maybe rope you into a rental contract or financing with really high rates, etc., just unfavorable terms, and they're trying to get you to lock into that contract and install it so fast that you now feel like you're obligated to go with that company, right? You feel like you have no options. By the time the dust settles and you sort of realize, oh, maybe I paid too much for this, it's maybe too late. Homeowners do have rights in Ontario and in other jurisdictions as well, so make sure you do your research. I believe in Ontario, it's at least 7 days, if not a bit longer, that you have to back out of any contract. So if you feel that you've been taken advantage of or maybe defrauded, there are these options. That's Consumer Protection Ontario does help, facilitate that. And there's a hotline you can call and maybe get some advice on your options there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so obviously, furnace is totally gone kaput middle of winter. So, I'm worried about pipes freezing, things like that. If I don't want to rush into just choosing a company and having them rush the job, and I'm trying to be wary of not getting caught in one of these scams, what kind of like intermediary options are there? What can I do just to make sure, I don't have plumbing burst or other things?
Yeah, so again, it can be a little bit tricky when you're in that situation. Ideally, if you have another, like a secondary heating system in your house of some kind, like a fireplace that you can use, gas or wood, that can put up enough heat. You really just need to make sure that the house stays kind of above that freezing point so you don't have any damage. Obviously, then there's, you got to consider comfort as well if you don't have somewhere else to stay. But as long as you can kind of keep it, warm enough, and typically you have a bit of time before it's going to get that cold. That's the ideal scenario. If you don't, typically you're going to want to get some space heaters. Electric space heaters, I like to recommend the oil-filled radiator style electric heaters. So they kind of look like a radiator coil. They plug in. They're a lot safer than some of the element-based ones because if they tip over, there's not a fire risk there, or it's much, much lower. So they're much safer and they're very efficient. And typically for a house, like a couple of those, like one on each floor, would be enough to, at least keep it at a reasonable temperature.
Yeah. Different line of questioning, but something I see all the time that kind of just occurs to me. Duct cleaning. See a lot of advertisements for duct cleaning.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've had a door-to-door one, but do you need it? Tell me about the duct cleaning services.
Yeah, for sure. So this has become kind of an infamous, scammy type of industry. Duct cleaning is a legitimate service. Like, it is something that you should probably get done every so often. Realistically, depending on your home, every 5 or 10 years is probably a good idea. You get a bit of buildup in the ducts. Keep in mind your furnace has a filter on it. So if you have some buildup in the return ducts going back to your furnace, it's going to get filtered at the furnace anyway. So if there's some dust and that sort of thing sitting in the actual return duct, it's not really that much of an issue. But again, good idea to maybe get that done every 5 or 10 years type of thing, just to make sure that, certainly in an extreme case, you might actually restrict the flow of the ductwork. So you want to avoid that. But yeah, I mean, every so often, good idea to do it. What we've recently seen is there's call centers that will try to sell duct cleaning services. So they're just call centers, and what all they do, my understanding of it, I'm certainly not in the duct cleaning industry, but basically it's a call center. They just, the ones that call you and say, how can we clean your ducts? They don't clean ducts, right? They're just a call center. They try to sell you the service, and then they find someone. They may not even have the duct cleaner locally yet. They just try to sell you the service, and then they'll get someone else to come and clean the ducts. Really, again, common industry where you'll also see, again, various techniques. You might see a really low ball price. Oh, a duct cleaning for $49 or $99 or something like that. Nobody's cleaning your ducts for $99. It's just not feasible to actually perform the service. What they do is they come out, that gets them in the door, and then typically they're going to charge you far more. They're going to charge you $400, $500, $600 because they're going to tell you, oh, you have buildup in your ducts, et cetera, right? And they're going to try to, again, you're kind of backed into a corner. You think, oh, Jesus, I got to take care of this. And then you end up in that situation. So with duct cleaning, I always say it is tricky to find online. So if you look up duct cleaning, you'll find a lot of those like ghost companies or phantom companies. It can be trickier to find like legitimate companies, but there's certainly legitimate local duct cleaning companies. If you can't find one online, and again, even wary of reviews, because a lot of them they just pay for reviews or whatever with their brand. Ask your local HVAC contractor. If you have, a company that you've used, just call them and say, hey, do you offer duct cleaning? If you don't, can you recommend someone? Typically, they'll know someone in the industry that, is a good service provider, and a reputable one will give you a price up front. They'll typically ask you like, Do you have one heating system in your home? About how many ducts do you have? Some basic questions, and they'll give you a flat price. And that's typically it. Be very wary of any kind of upsells with that, because duct sanitation is a common, whatever they can tell you, and it's not necessary in 99% of cases.
Cool. One other question for you. Wanted to ask about maintenance. Maintaining your furnace, just kind of checks.
Yeah.
Number one, obviously, you should get your furnace serviced fairly regularly.
Yep.
First question, do I need to get my furnace serviced annually? And the second part is, if it's a forced air furnace, which is I think most common in Ontario,
For sure. Yeah.
is what can I, as a homeowner, do to kind of check up on my furnace? What should I be doing for the maintenance? So
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a homeowner, I guess there's two things that you want to kind of do yourself on a routine basis. One is change your furnace filters. How often you have to change them will depend on the type of filter you have. So typically, if you have like a 1-inch filter, so they're only about an inch thick, you need to change those about every month, maybe 2 months if it's a slightly higher quality one, or a thicker one, so a 4 or 5-inch thick furnace filter. They're going to be a little more expensive to purchase. Those are typically every 6 months. So as a rule of thumb, I change them at daylight savings time, because we have daylight savings in the spring and the fall. So I change my furnace filter when we have daylight savings time. It's a good reminder, right? So rule of thumb, you're sort of changing it for cooling season and heating season. So that is an important thing to do. Another thing you can do is clean your air conditioning coil. It's a little more of a process. There's some how-tos online and stuff you can find. Basically, you're just trying to get some of that debris off of the outside unit of your air conditioner to make sure that air is flowing through it, and that can help prevent equipment damage and breakdown. In terms of professional maintenance, I would say I would always recommend referring to the manufacturer's guidelines on it. Some manufacturers do specify, so especially if you're buying a newer furnace that's under warranty, make sure you either look at the manual or contact the company, find out what their requirement is. Some of them do require maintenance every year, I think would be pretty uncommon, but maybe every couple of years. So they do require regular maintenance. Sometimes that's loosely defined, maybe it's a little more refined. Again, be aware if you're buying a new furnace for a manufacturer's warranty, typically the service just needs to be done by a licensed technician. It does not need to necessarily be done by the company that you purchased it from. Their warranty, so the labor warranty, is typically offered by the HVAC company. That may require you to service with them in order for them to honor it. So Cole's notes, long answer, but Cole's notes is just make sure you read the fine print and be aware of what the manufacturer's requirements are, what the requirements are if you're trying to maintain one of those warranties as well.